My name is Jackie. I work with ACIC. I work predominantly with youth programs. I'm really excited to have you all here today. Before we get started, we would like to do a quick land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that we live and work in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which the Mi'kmaq and the Wolastoqiyik people first signed with the British Crown in 1725, making us all treaty people committed to the ongoing relationship between nations and to reconciliation. In addition, Nova Scotia is also home to a rich African Nova Scotian community of over 50 communities that have contributed greatly to the communities, the land that we live, work on, learn on, and connect on. I think it's also worth acknowledging in the current context and climate of today, when we talk about land and occupied territories and nations, that we also acknowledge the ongoing occupation and genocide occurring in Palestine. And I would also just encourage folks to take a little bit of time to maybe think about what that means for us as we learn today with our guest and with each other. And we have the privilege of learning, unlearning, educating, connecting, what that means when we work on occupied territories and when there is still ongoing occupation occurring and genocide occurring in the world today. So let's just take a little moment to think about, what that means for our practice, our work, our learning. Okay, thank you. We're really grateful to have you all here today, that you're taking a little bit of time out of your lunch or out of your day to connect and learn with us and to hear some wonderful thoughts and perspectives from Ishmael and from Kaylee, who is our moderator. I am going to just do a quick introduction of Kaylee Wong, who is going to moderate this conversation with Ishmael, and then Kaylee's going to take it over and do some introductions and a little housekeeping from there. Kaylee Wong is a master's in public science student at McGill University on a McBain scholarship. As a former member of the Canadian Armed Forces, her research specializes in military sexual violence, gendered institutions, and organizational culture change. She has worked on a number of defense advisory initiatives, including as a member of the Women's Veterans Forum and as a witness in the parliamentary study into women's veterans experiences. Kaylee is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Asian Resilience Collective Canada, ARC, which has just released the second edition of its publication focused on the Asian Canadian experience, ARC magazine. So I'm gonna hand it over to Kaylee, and Kaylee's going to take it from there. Thanks, Kaylee.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. I want to ask Jackie for Ishmael's introduction. Do you have that?
I do. I can grab that. Sorry, folks. There we go. I'm going to drop it in the chat so that folks can read along and so that you can read it as well, Kaylee. There we go. There we go. Oh, my message is too long. I'm going to have to do it in two pieces. That's because you got a lot of good stuff going on, Ishmael.
Very prolific person.
Yeah. Did you ever think you'd be one of these people that has like a really long bio?
No, no, I didn't think that, but here we are.
Recently, ACIC hosted the Minister of International Development, and your bio is equal to his with some very wonderful things in there. So we're lucky to have you.
Thank you.
There you go.
Awesome. So you guys can see it in the chat, but I'll just go through it as well for everyone. But yeah, we're very lucky to have Ishmael here today. He is a Sierra Leonean and American author of the novels Little Family, Radiance of Tomorrow, and the very well-known memoir A Long Way Gone, the #1 New York Times international bestseller. Has been published in over 40 languages. On this book, the Washington Post writes, everyone should read this book. We should read it to learn more about the world and what it means to be human. Ishmael's novels, written with the gentle lyricism of a dream and the moral clarity of a fable, are powerful stories about preserving what means the most to us, even in uncertain times. The New York Times find in his writing an allegorical richness and a remarkable humanity to his characters, a profound and tender portrayal of the connections we forged to survive the fate we're dealt, marking the further blossoming of a unique global voice. He is arguably the most read contemporary African author, and he's currently completing the sequel of his memoir set up to be published next year. Alongside his rich literary work, he's also a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador for children affected by conflict, a practitioner and expert in conflict resolution. In this capacity, he's worked at the international, local, community, personal, with companies, public and private spaces to resolve conflict by bringing adversaries to the table for dialogue through empathetic methods of listening, not only to solve conflict, but provide sustainable tools to prevent their recurrence. He has worked globally to mitigate conflict and prevent the resumption from villages, communities in Sierra Leone following the civil conflict, Rwanda, Uganda, South Africa, companies in Geneva, Paris, New York, Los Angeles, and a number of organizations, universities, as well as the United Nations. So we're incredibly grateful to have him here today. Ishmael, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So for our conversation today, we really want to keep this as interactive as possible, really encourage participation throughout. So we are going to have a dedicated time towards the end, maybe 10-15 minutes where people can ask questions then. But also I would really encourage the audience, if you have a question that, makes sense for kind of the topic that we're talking about on hand, please feel free to raise your hand. Like with the raise your hand function on Zoom, or you can also just type it out in the chat, and I'm going to try and weave it all in so we can kind of have this community-based conversation here today. Awesome. So to start us off, I kind of want to talk about storytelling as, a prolific, very well-read storyteller, Ishmael, whose story has touched and influenced so many people around the world. We're kind of curious about what your thoughts are on why we need to make space for perspectives and stories, and more broadly, kind of the importance of storytelling in social understanding, and by extension, hopefully social change. You can speak to that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for everybody who's here, and thank you, Kelly, for setting this up very nicely to begin with. Well, first of all, I come from an oral tradition, storytelling background and culture. So even before going to school, there's an understanding that stories are medicine. And this medicine is something that needs to be poured into the world for people to understand what they're dealing with, the past, and hopefully to head towards a future that is sipped into the good things humanity has to offer. I believe that storytelling or stories are ways for people to express themselves. This is a way for us not only to learn to understand each other, but to also deepen our understanding of each other, which I think is missing today in so many ways. Oftentimes, we are conflict because of small misunderstanding, and also why storytelling is particularly important today, particularly from diverse voices, is the fact that over the years, you've seen that there's a heavy conversation, basically from the Western world, about how the world should progress. Whereas the global South is kind of left behind as if there is no intelligence or knowledge in these spaces, right? So I started writing actually to undo some of that. I grew up in a place that was a former British colony, and to this day, most people are very colonized there. And so the discourse is often about the idea that when it comes to intelligence or knowledge or any way of thinking, we're secondary to those things. But the only reason is because we're not given the space to truly share our perspectives and our voices. And when that part of the world is missing in the conversation, obviously, decisions are going to be made, whether foreign policy, otherwise, when it comes to human rights, when it comes to international rules and regulations, it's going to be in the favor of the predominant voice that we always hear, you know? And so when I started writing, it was an uphill battle to try and show people that, listen, I want to give context to where I'm coming from because I know my story. If you go into my village where I'm from in Sierra Leone, you will not know certain things because you're not from that context. But often what happens is that we would have a journalist from the Western world who goes for 5 minutes and they win a Pulitzer Prize for having been there for 5 minutes. And they become the person who speaks for those people, you know? And so you realize that the truth will never come out. So for me, human context is very necessary. It's good to hear from everybody. Also, this is how we learn to disagree with people, but also from that disagreement to learn something, rather than disagreement becoming conflict only and leaving at that. The more we hold other voices and the importance of telling everybody's story, the more we learn about the things we need to hold there and cherish and fight for as humanity, generally speaking, you know? And so we don't do that often, you know? I live in Sierra Leone currently. And for example, whenever journalists come to Sierra Leone, the newspapers already have an agenda why they're coming. They're going to say, we want a feel-good story from Sierra Leone. So anything as anybody has to say doesn't work anymore. But what is a feel-good story? Is a feel-good story a fight to undo certain injustice? That's a feel-good story, but that's not what they want, right? They want something that's not going to hold anybody accountable, particularly from the West, about that story. So oftentimes, even our fight towards whatever democracy, governance, freedom of speech is curtailed by the very idea of leaving the storytelling and the voices and the cultural aspects of it out. So we are not in the conversation. So how can we be part of anything, you know? So for me, this is quite important, you know?
Absolutely. And I think it's nice you're kind of speaking to, you know, storytelling as medicine almost in two ways. One being the personal aspect of it, that healing, but one also being the political, and very interrelated in that sense of, you know, we need kind of these stories to bridge away, you know, between people, of transcending perceived barriers of your beliefs and my beliefs, and connecting on what we share and our humanness, but also kind of storytelling as a way to say that, you know, these policy decisions are privileging a certain perspective. You know, it's kind of this myth of like, you know, this is a universal solution when it has always been informed and coming from perspectives, historically anyways, always from the West. So I really like that connection you make in both realms, personally and politically, that storytelling really impacts the way we go about doing our work and everything.
But, you know, often people also forget that politics is also about people, right? I mean, politicians tend to forget that very quickly, you know, and people who engage in politics are also human beings. They live in the very same world we all live in, right? So they are one and all, you know. And it made me think of this idea for many years back. I don't know if people are familiar with it. There's a writer called Amadou Ampateba. And he was very much part of the diplomatic thinking of the United Nations. And what he used to do at the Security Council General Assembly is to tell stories as they sat to make policy, because his idea was that if you don't understand the context of why you need to make that policy, you're going to miss out on the fact that this is essential for a human being, you know, for every human being, and it must be applied. So he would tell stories to bring people closer to the table. And when you realize that even the most effective politicians, how they get policies passed is to tell a good story about why the policy is important. So people always forget that how human beings communicate, what we say to each other, what we hear, what we allow to be part of our thinking, the challenges that we allow to be part of our thinking, because we're also evolving as human beings. So once we say that knowledge is static, there's one way to do something, we're bound to fail. We evolve every day. So hence you must be challenged all the time. It doesn't mean that people are undoing your value system. If your value system is never challenged, how do you believe that it's still good? or it's still true. But there's a fear in the world nowadays for that, so which makes even people retreat to their corners and then form their own opinion, not based on truth. I'm not talking about facts. I'm talking about truth. There are certain truths and there are facts that add to that truth, but truth is no longer part of discourse, So because we are not allowing a multiplicity of voices to be part of the discussion so that it can enrich the understanding of who we are as a human being in this world. Because one way or the other, we rely on each other, whether we like it or not. We've made other people disbelieve that we rely on them so that we can continue to dehumanize them, right? But eventually that stops,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, kind of this truth versus facts speaks to the way that I think stories can sometimes convey a certain emphasis on something, the way that statistics can't, the way that, write-ups can, all these sorts of things. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Like, for example, in my case, I came from the war in Sierra Leone when we had a civil war in that country, and I was unfortunately part of the young people who were dragged into that war. The first few journalists who went to Sierra Leone basically drew the conclusion that young people who had been dragged into that war would never recover. They are time bombs. They're only capable of violence. They have no intelligence, none of that. And then here I come out of that situation, not only writing books, but also challenging that very idea and saying that, well, actually, you know what, to survive these things, resilient is actually intelligence. I changed that perception because people used to think resilience is just you getting used to a certain way of living and saying that there's nothing you can do about it. That's not resilient. That's kind of stupidity. Resilience is a way for you to find a way to not accept what circumstances have thrown at you, to find yourself in all of this difficulty and madness, to still be able to stand somewhere and speak as well as the person who has never had to fight for food in their life, who has never had to think about clean drinking water, all of these things, right? It does not diminish your intelligence just because you live in that environment. You may not have the opportunities. You see what I mean? So immediately, if that conversation I hadn't come into it, that would have been the belief that the world has, that a child who gets succumbed to violence at a very young age is unintelligent, cannot amount to anything, nothing can be done for them. And whatever knowledge I have to share with the world would never be part of it, right? So you see, so this is what I'm saying anyway,
Yeah. No, I mean, your life, your story is an incredible case study in the way that, our stories can kind of break the perceived images, the single stories we have for people, the presumptions about what their life will look like because of circumstances. So yeah, it's incredible. I think here we can shift over and kind of move into a topic that you've been speaking a little bit about on, which is freedom of speech. So like you were saying, as someone who has used the power of speech to bring to light the stories of child soldiers, how do you perceive the importance of freedom of speech in society, especially for those regions impacted by conflict? And, I'd really like to hear a little bit more about what we spoke about yesterday in terms of, you kind of feel that there's this tried and true method of oppressing voices or censorship that begins, before it gets to journalists or everyday citizens. It really begins with artists, for their unique ability to kind of transcend certain things. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, throughout history, if you look at wherever there has been an oppressive government or wherever people have clamped down on the way the world should think or react, they go after artists, right? Politicians are seasonal. They come for 1 term, 2 terms, 3 terms, they go. Artists are sort of internal because what we try to do is to take moments in our current existence and have people understand it deeply, right? Whether it's through fiction, nonfiction, whether it's through essays, we give people the space to think about what they're already feeling, but they don't have the language to put on it. So we leave an imprint of that particular moment in the memory of humanity, So we're able to do that. And that is liberation, because we're pushing constantly human beings to be able to be critical of the spaces they live in, to ask questions, to hold people accountable. So whenever you have an oppressive place, that's why the artists go first, right? Because we are not trying to win the next election. We're trying to make sure people are fully themselves, that they're able to live with the full version of their lives, And that requires some people being responsible for making sure that they do that and not lie to them, right? So once you do that, once that starts and the artist stops speaking, then the next thing is the journalist. Then the next thing is the population. But now, if you look at the temperature of the world, that is not just in places where there are oppressive governments anymore. That's kind of becoming a global thing right now, where we are in this space, in time and history in the world, where you can't say certain things, you can't say certain truths, you can't have certain conversations. So we actually have become our own police to make sure that we don't have freedom of speech, because we fear so much about what you say and how it can be interpreted by others. So we don't speak anymore. And that's very, very dangerous. We're seeing it. Everybody, there's no discourse anymore. Even the academic institutions, there are no discourse anymore. Places where once you would have challenging conversations, they're not allowed to happen, because God forbid you mention something about other people's humanity. And that is undermining everything we've held there before. The world has once believed that every human life is valuable and sacrosanct. But we begin to see that's not really how the world feels about it. But we can have that conversation, right? If you live in certain parts of the world, your life is not as valuable. We've undermined human rights law, international law, we've undermined everything. And all is happening also with complicity to it, because we don't speak up. When you speak up, you get vilified, right? Mm-hmm. So the governments that are already oppressive doing that to their people, this is good for them. They don't have to do the work anymore. Other people are doing it for them. Everybody's been silenced one way or the other, whether you like it or not. There are no more spaces to have a true conversation about what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in the global south, what's happening everywhere in the world. You can't speak about it. It stops at anger. Whereas the true definition of freedom of speech is the idea to be uncomfortable as well. It's the idea to have conversations with people you disagree with, but you're willing to hear. And from there, maybe something can come out of it. But if there's no space to even hear the other side, there's no space to even have a conversation, there's no space for the truth, mm-hmm. Then what, who is one government in the Western world to tell anybody else about freedom of speech if you're silencing your own citizens even to begin with, because you want to align yourself with a certain popular way? Many years ago, I remember I was having a discussion with another intellectual who is not from the global south, who is not Black, who is not any of these things, not indigenous, none of these things. And they were trying to defend the work of Conrad, right? And saying that, well, Conrad wrote at that time because during his time, these were popular beliefs. So therefore he had to, and I'm like, are you serious? So basically you're saying that if there is a certain harm to humanity happening because it's what's popularized, if you speak about it, you get put aside, you're just going to follow that trend. That makes no sense whatsoever, Plus, if he considered himself an artist as a writer, but not as part of the colonial project, he could have said so. But, we have to call things for what it is. And Chinua Achebe had written an essay about Conrad that most people did not like, Even he was not allowed to have the space to chastise something that is considered canonical. Again, I'm coming back to what I said earlier about the fact that knowledge evolves. Our value system evolves, human beings evolve. So in lieu of that, so should be our value system, our thinking, and the things that we hold there. How long is the Western world going to speak for the global South? We have our own ways of speaking as well, And actually, we have things to add to the global discourse, to knowledge, to what happens, I mean, we also have our natural resources that are taken from us, but that's okay. That's another conversation. But then we should be silent as well, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost comical at this state. I think it's going to reach a point where nobody can hold anybody accountable for any value system because you haven't been able to do it in your own countries. Why would you ask somebody else to do it differently, So, and for example, I live in Sierra Leone. I come from a place where, freedom of speech is not allowed. If you're not praising the people who are in power, then you're looked at. Even though you're speaking the truth, you're asking people to look at the facts and think about it. Don't you want a population that knows how to receive information and digest it and be critical about it? Somehow, critical thinking and intelligence and common sense have become very dangerous tools. These are things that were celebrated before, right? We all paid money, went to this university so we can learn how to think critically, how to have debates, learn about other people. But then all of a sudden the world says now we all should be silent and don't say what can be said, you know? So it's an interesting time to be an artist, but to be a human being, to be a father, to be a brother, sister, mother, all these things are complicated nowadays, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. And even on the topic of Conrad, I remember when I was in high school, I think, no, maybe in my first year university, but we read The Heart of Darkness, and there were these really valid criticisms coming up in class, but our teacher, it's a Canadian woman, really ardently like defended it as, you know, as you say, this Western canonical status. And I think that's kind of like almost this theme that, you know, the global north, the west, whatever, it's kind of strategically taking advantage of not just like preconceptions that are held about certain regions and almost weaponizing those images and narratives for their benefit, but also of existing cleavages that exist to kind of divide and polarize society more in a way. On kind of a more, I suppose, not optimistic, but kind of like in a way that we can think about this. And so what do we do? I'm interested to hear about, you know, your, yeah, you know, you've talked about storytellers as artists can put words, visuals, music, etc., to a moment, a feeling in a way that's really liberating. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to the way that we can translate that to some sort of healing, artist capacity to accommodate and allow people to heal, not just on an individual level, but also on a society-wide level, and kind of the importance of artists in that context.
Well, if you look at most societies that are thriving, is usually where the arts is also thriving, right? If you look at them, it's where, because the artist, you know, and when I say the artist, generally every artist, not just the writer, the painter, the musician, they are giving not only voices and a way for people to understand what's happening currently, but also, like what I said earlier, they are giving medicine to people. Because when you truly think about what you're going through, there's already a burden that you're lifting off of that experience itself, right? But when there's repression, you're not allowed to think about it, then you're just this pressure cooker, and then people explode in different ways, you know, literally speaking, you know? So I think what the artist is truly always at work is liberation, you know? I always say that for me, when I write, I always tell people that for me, writing is a practice of liberation. Artistry is a practice of liberation. And that liberation is not just for you, it's for your audience, the people who will see your painting, who will read your stuff, who will connect to that moment, who will then use those stories as exits and entrances into their own personal lives, public life, and everything else that comes with that, you know? So artists are sort of like these people who have these little portals, always giving entrances and exits to folks to navigate the complexities of our lives, you know, of the given time that we're in, you know. And when the world is changing, we don't consume information the way we used to, you know. We have more access to information, but perhaps not always the way we thought to really understanding and sift through it. So you also have artists who then streamline that so people can understand in a certain way. So the artist's work is always ongoing, you know. And the artist is also somebody who lives ideas, and ideas don't die. Once they have been birthed, they stay. So even if the artist is gone, the ideas live. This is why artists are also considered very dangerous, right? You can destroy people's lives, you can destroy a whole generation, but you cannot destroy the idea of liberation, of them wanting to have the life the way they want to have. You can't. You will try. People have tried over in history again. You can't, you know? Once an idea is born, it becomes, it lives, you know? So I think that's what the artist is always doing, is giving that lifeline to people to understand that, yes, these are difficult times, but here's a little bit of history, but there's also a little bit of present, and here's a hint to the future. Take the road you want to take, you know? So even the artists, when they're doing all of these things, they're not coercing people to follow what they're saying. They're opening doors for people to walk to which one they want to walk to, or to go in there and create other doors and exits and windows and whatever they want, right? Some years ago, I was in Nigeria, and I encountered some very well-meaning young people who had come from the State Department, and they had a grant. And the idea was that they were going to go into the north in Nigeria, and they were going to teach people critical thinking. And they were very excited about this project. And I said to them, well, don't you think that people have critical thinking in the north or in anywhere else in Africa? They said, no. I was like, are you serious? Because you don't know the history. People don't know their history. They may have forgotten it because the educational systems we inherited continue to colonize us. So we don't have critical thinking. We don't rely on our own methods anymore. But people do have that. And they said, no, but we're going to, and I was like, okay. And I was like, so you're going to teach them critical thinking. You know what critical thinking is? They say, yes. For people to be able to make their own. And I say, okay, what if you teach them how to critically think and then they decide that they don't like America, they don't like American values? Are you going to be okay with that? They said, no. They will not. So basically, you want to teach them critically to think the way you want. That's not critical thinking, you know. That's still enslavement in one way or the other of the mind, of the way the person thinks, right? So the idea to liberate somebody is to set them free, even if they have to be against your value system. That's the point. That's the point. So that's what the artist does. You liberate people's way of being, people's way of thinking, so that they are no longer shackled by anything, including their own minds and their own limitations and the environments they live in. And when that happens, you have to be willing, you know, for them to challenge you. And that's the beauty. But somehow people are afraid of that, you know? So there's still this sort of control, you know? I want you to be smart, but only the way I want you to be smart, you know?
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah,
You know?
and it's kind of like the opposite almost of what the politician, what the world leaders offer us, and not so much not asking for followers or a way of thinking, but simply creating and paving the paths and saying, feel what you feel, and go from there. We have a question from Zainab. If you want to unmute yourself, feel free to ask Ishmael directly.
Yeah, thank you. Statement and a question behind it. Thank you so much, and thank you, one, of bringing us Ishmael. Ishmael, I'm a Sierra Leonean. I'm a Canadian, born and raised in Sierra Leone, just like you. And I'm a Canadian from Winnipeg, Manitoba. The weather is nice. I'm glad.
Yeah, it's very cold there, so I'm glad the weather is nice.
Well, we call it nice now because anywhere I go, I'm running to come back. I can't stay for long somewhere where there is hot. Yeah, thank you for being here, and we appreciate. As I said, I'm a Canadian, live in Canada, and based on the story, like me too, we created our organization called Canada Sierra Leone Friendship, based on a storytelling from the Nova Scotian to travel to Sierra Leone. So I've been doing things in Sierra Leone because I have a master's in international development, leadership, women, conflict transformation in peace from Nova Scotia, Agonesh Cody University. And I've been running around medical through PTSD. I cannot finish my doctorate in medicine because anytime I go theater, I always fainted. So I go back and minor in political and global politics. So I've been running around working, and my main love author of the book called Duncan Green, From Poverty to Power. So I focus on it. So being that I've been working in Canada, in Manitoba for homelessness, and I transform the program in Sierra Leone. Like what you are explaining, it's kind of you focus more on writing the stories. And as a Canadian and my children born here, I'm so proud, my education, so on and so forth. In Sierra Leone, we have lots of over 250, 60 organizations. Artists come in, just like you said. So like as a Canadian, proud to be an educated, and I wanted to transform the ideology of how people explore in the country without youth to bring, to educate. And I'm glad, thank God, to Canadian governments sponsoring our organizations and rallying for them, especially with the Atlantic international organizations. Do you think writing books will be enough to transform the message to the people rather than doing action? For example, a few days ago, last month, we got $6,000 of from MCIC to do farming, because our organization in Sierra Leone, we do farming. We give women and we give children. Even right now, there are students that are doing computer training. They are in this group listening. I ask them. So we have difficulties in that country, and this is what we want to change, the scenario or the method from Canada. One, Canada, we don't understand the Canadian money, but they are in Sierra Leone. People don't have it, and we are struggling, especially me when I'm traveling. So my question now is, do you think of, just like, let me repeat again, do you think writing will be enough for transformed the initiative of changing from poverty to power? Or do you think doing activists of talking like just like I started, do you think it's more powered to people than doing the action of giving them, like right now we have a sustainable job training fund that we are writing? Can we, do you think of just writing, people having books to read or singing will be enough of doing all this into perspective, into development? I hope you understand, because you understand my
I
question,
understand
because
your
I've been
question.
wrong talking.
I understand your question perfectly. First of all, I'm not only a writer, I'm also an activist, and I don't think there's any one single solution. Let's just start with that. We have to approach the situation on all fronts. When I became a writer, I had a foundation, and the goal of it in the beginning was to take proceeds from my first book to rebuild schools that had been destroyed in the war. Right after the war, I rebuilt several schools in the country. I had a scholarship fund that funded kids to go to school all the way from primary school to university all across the country. I did that for years. I didn't say much about it to the world because I wasn't looking for that kind of acknowledgement. It's something I wanted to do. I feel nourishing the mind is equally as important as giving the mind, the body food to eat in a way, because then you teach the human being how to stand up for themselves, how to demand of their leaders of themselves. So you stop being the one raising funds to do stuff for them all the time. So all of these things have to happen at the same time. In Sierra Leone at the moment, for example, most people, we came out of a war. We've never had a discussion to truly recover in that country. So most people don't even know how to plan for the future. And that includes some of the people who have power and in government now, ministers. So they're making poor decisions that are not in the benefit of their people because we don't have the mindset. So the mind needs to be nourished while we put in other infrastructural things in place. We don't have electricity in Sierra Leone. I was there 4 days before I left. There was no light. So how do you improve anybody? This is 2024. If you're a young person in any country, everything is online. By the time you charge your phone 4 days later, you've lost all the opportunity you need to get. So how do we challenge that? We need to be able to think and hold our leaders accountable. We need not to clap. I'm not a fan of singing. We need not to clap for our leaders when they tell us they've done something. They are paid to do it. It's their job. I want the person they're working for to understand a minister in Sierra Leone, even the president, works for them. That's the job. If we change that mindset, they would demand more rather than waiting for petty change and little help and then clapping. So as much as we can work on improving them in all those real hard areas, the mind is the most. If we don't decolonize the mind, we don't teach people how to think, they will constantly be taken advantage of over and over and over and over again. That's what we have in Sierra Leone, how every election people sing and dance for the same people who come in and do the same thing to them all over again. And then they sing it as have they stopped to think that, listen, we don't want this type of people to rule us anymore, you know? Have they gone on the street to protest, not just to run and cause violence, but to think deeply about what? Because people don't have the space. Yes, they don't have the space because their life has been stripped down to the bare necessities so much that they don't even have the space to think. So I don't think my books can change the world or change Sierra Leoneans, but I think they can make people start to think and take responsibilities for themselves, so that when you come through that funding and teach them a job opportunity, they know how to think about that job for the future. So all these little things work in concert together. We have to do it at all fronts, but most importantly, the mindset has to change. And that can only change by giving the mind nourishment to think, to question, to act, to hold people accountable. In my country, for example, Israel, one of the big problems we have now is this thing called Kush against young people who are taking this type of drug that's really destroying them. What happens? The politicians turn around and blame them and say it's their fault. But what creates an environment for young people to succumb to drugs is because there's no social things in place for them. They don't have light, they are poor, they don't have water, they don't have, so it's depressing. There's a psychological element to deal with everyday life. So you want to escape it. And if anything is available, a substance that helps you escape, you do it. So it's not their fault. But God forbid we ask that critical question, right? Then we're asking that person to do their job. And they don't want to do it. So therefore, so I think all of what we're doing together would work. But we need to attack the problem at the source, which is that we need to have people think for themselves, ask questions, challenge the leadership, you know?
Ishmael is the instruction, and just like Obama said once when he gave speech in Ghana, institutions are the most critical something. It's not the politicians, because if the institutions are strong, but can you imagine, me too, I used to be a teacher back home. Just imagine myself, 75 people in a class.
Yep.
So just imagine, the institutions are weak. And also people are rallying, say, oh, this is how we do it.
Yeah.
So the mindset, like me, my prayer is any funding I have, bringing them in, train them Canadian education is the best. The whole wide world, I can say that. Canadian education is the best because you know why? I've been there. Even though I carry $50,000 student loan, but I don't regret it because the way I educate, the way my behavior, even when I go to Sierra Leone, everywhere I traveled, people know, say, oh, this one from Canada. The way I behave, the way I eat, the way we communicate,
yeah,
that's the way, because Canadian institutions, education are very strong, strict, and work it together.
But, you know, I think these things are usually strong in places where the government is truly interested in liberating their people and in building a future for them, right? The Sierra Leone education system is not preparing anybody to really do that. For example, if you're a student at a university and you ask your teacher a challenging question they don't know, they fail you. And there's no way this is the truth. And there's nowhere. So you're already forming citizens who do not challenge because they know what happens. And those same citizens then become the ministers and things like that. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to use the same methodology they know, which is to repress thinking, repress opinion. And when that happens, you cannot have progress, right? You cannot have progress because people are not asking the right questions. Everybody's afraid of saying anything because they've been told throughout their lives that having intelligence and particularly holding people accountable is not accepted, you know? So that's exactly what we have in Sierra Leone, but also globally, that's what's happening. Don't ask questions, just go with what you've been told is how it should be, you know? But human nature is not like that. We will self-destruct when that happens eventually, you know, because we just are like that, you know? There's also that wheel that's turning, that's saying that, wait a minute, I don't believe that's what I'm talking about, the truth. It's always there. There's something that's shaking in your head. Even you as a human being, you know when you're doing something wrong, even if you haven't been told it's wrong, you can feel it, right? So it's almost on an instinctual level, the truth, how it's needed, you know? And eventually people will just put themselves to shame that are telling lies and things like that so that we don't find the truth. We will find it's in us. We know when something is wrong. We don't need to know the international law or human rights law. We will know that this doesn't seem right.
The human intuition.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Keeping in mind time, I want to open up the floor for anyone else who might have questions. You can raise your hand or you can send a message in the group chat. If anyone else has another question. Otherwise, I definitely have more for you, Ishmael. All right. Well, at any point, if anyone would like to ask a question. Okay, I see Ada. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask Ishmael?
Yes. Thank you, Ishmael. Thank you for your very incisive words. I just want you to maybe make a comment on, in recent times we've been hearing about decolonization, reparation and all of that. I don't know, what is your opinion? Are we making any progress looking at where we are, especially in international development? You think we are making progress, or are we just talk and not making any progress?
That's a very important question. I think we're all talk. We're talking, and we are not making any progress, because when you look at international development or anything international, the line of thinking is coming from the Western world, right? So the global South then has to receive that idea. That's already is the same colonization mentality. We know what you want and we're going to come give it to you, and you should just take it because we know what's good for you. But we don't even know where you live. We don't know your environment, right? And even the way the stories are told with all organizations that work on the ground, oftentimes they are only selling the horrible story, but not the intelligence that's on the ground or the resourcefulness that could be there if people are given, But slowly on the African continent, we're having places that are resisting that, but not en masse yet, right? And then you have other people who are trying to tag along with it as if they too are doing it. For example, what happened in Burkina Faso, right? When Captain Touareg came in and he kicked out the French. That's a very bold move that before most people would not do. But why should the French be taking all the resources and deciding the fate, Now there are conversations about the CFA, the money that France controls. Why do we rely on that? So people are finding ways to cut those colonial boundaries. Now the young fellow who came in Senegal, we will see what he has yet to do. So there's a movement that's coming. In Mali, there's movements that are coming, but they are not the majority, because we still have the big boys, the people who have been ruling these places, who are in cahoots with the colonial powers to this day, because they benefit from it, who do not want that change. Because then you and I finally recognizes our power, and they will not be relevant. So they don't want that conversation. So it's not just the Western world, it's also the people that have created to make sure that we don't come out of this, who are completely colonized, who only rely on the West for everything, right? And even forget our ancestral knowledge, our history, none of those things. For example, somebody was asking earlier, does knowledge change? My books are taught everywhere in the world, in universities, everywhere. In Sierra Leone, they are not. They are not. Because there's a fear that if people read it, they may ask questions, right? They are not taught. So even when I'm in Sierra Leone, I live there, people don't read anything. So how do we bring even our own knowledge back home? So, and also, we haven't really taken a stand to challenge what has been imposed on us. We have not. You know, at the end of the day, everybody's going to look for their own little cut to get here and there, and they're not going to really stand up to ask these questions, to say that, listen, it's enough with the talk. And we have the power. We can control our own natural resources. We can do certain things the way we want. Are we truly going to do that? Many years ago, I was somewhere and somebody said something that truly upset me. And this is the following. And often the colonial puppets and people who are part of this still colonial push say these things. Oh, the African continent has a problem with leadership. No, we don't. The problem is this. Whenever we have leaders who truly care for their people, the West kills them. It doesn't like them. We've seen it. They assassinate them. That's it. So they don't like the leaders that work for us. They want the leaders that work for the West to make those deals that benefit the West. Are we going to have that conversation? Maybe this next generation would have that. We're not willing to have any of those conversations. So we always would talk these big talks about things that are happening. And now, you know, even in international development, particularly, there's language now to say a lot without saying anything, you know. People speak about development and they say all these things, they're like, but what do you really mean? You know, we're going to scale it up. It's going to be sustainable. So what does that truly mean on the ground in the lives of somebody who's there? You know, we don't say anything about it, right? And what happens when international development partners go into a place like Sierra Leone, for example? Let me just paint a quick picture for that. Say we get funding, $30 million to go build a certain project from the EU, for example, in Sierra Leone. What happens? Experts are brought from the EU to work on that project. And their salary comes from that money, and most of it is already remain in Europe, right? Don't you think we have lots of experts on the African continent? Some of them even studied in the West that can go and do a better job than the European partners. No, they go. And they're supposed to come up with the solutions for us. Obviously, they are biased. They don't know what they are looking at. They don't speak the languages. They don't know anything. So they hire somebody else to do the translation for them, and they do workshops. They get per diems, and they get a vehicle that drives them around. By the time the real project comes to fruition, there's no money left because it's already been spent. But that country now has a GDP that puts that money in context, but we don't see anything for it, right? Now, if you hire somebody from the ground who knows the ground, they can go directly to the problem. You don't need to have meetings to know that people are poor. You can see it. You know, what do you need to do? Action. You build something. Certain countries, you see that happening. You need to build infrastructure, institutions. You need to give people true opportunities that are not based on tribalism, that are not based on them being beholden to you. You know? Do you hire the right people that know what to do and you give them the space to do that? Or do you hire people who don't have the right expertise and they're so grateful that you gave them a position that they just do whatever you tell them to do? You know? Do we have the legal system? Is the judiciary different from the executive branch? No, it's not. I tell you one last thing that you will laugh about Sierra Leone. Before I left, there was a meeting in Parliament in Sierra Leone for the constitutional review of Sierra Leone, which first of all has already happened before. A long time ago, it just needs to be implemented. But during that particular meeting in Parliament, Sierra Leone, constitutional review, we have the UK High Commissioner present and the American Ambassador present. It's a constitutional review. You're laughing. Too serious, man. This is what I'm talking about. Like, so some of us see this and I'm like, seriously, man. Like, really, like when you're in the UK, do you get invited to the UK? I mean, for when they're doing constitutional review for, you know, because you're an ambassador. But we see these things and we're like, and some of us, when we point it out, and people say, oh, but you're just speaking up. No, but these are the things that set us back. Why are they present? What has it got to do with them? You know? How come the paramount chief for somebody or the kids on the street are not present to add something to what they want, you know? Anyway, I could go on and on, but let me leave it at that. So you kind of got my answer, you know?
Perfect. So we just have 4 minutes left. I might just do one last question for you, Ishmael, and it's from our group chat from Roshni, and it says, artists in which artists get to tell their stories around the world are still within a capitalist, colonial, power-centric systems that have been set up over time. What, to you, Ishmael, would be a decolonial way of working with and highlighting art? So how do we make sure we tell stories that challenge the system itself?
Well, it's an uphill battle. I mentioned it earlier. First of all, it's an uphill battle. When I started writing, one of the first things I had to undo was all what every journalist who had got a police had written about what happened in Sierra Leone, about what happened to people like me, that I'm unintelligent, I can barely speak English. So first of all, I had to undo all of that. So there's a lot of undoing and then writing new thoughts. But the structures still remain the same. For example, I say something that most people don't even think about. When the rights of your book written in English gets bought in the UK by your publishing house, there's a clause in the contract to this day that says that that UK publishing house owns those rights in all the former British colonies. There's a clause.
Wow.
Yeah, yes. And so, but they are not interested in publishing it in those countries because they don't think there's a market and they've never bothered to create one. So basically you have to shame them and tell them, if you don't give me back that particular clause so I can find a Kenyan publisher or South African publisher, you know, or somebody in Namibia to publish it, I'm just going to write an article and tell the world about it, and then they give it to you. But that is still exists, you know. So even the right to have, you know, our textbooks are still printed in the UK and brought into Sierra Leone, you know. Why can't the government invest in our own printing mechanism? So, you know, when you are in school, you learn mostly British history. You don't learn anything about African history. You don't. You read European history first. So that's kind of almost saying that your own history is not even important and it doesn't matter, you know? So these things are still there. So some of us, there are lots of movement on the ground amongst artists, the Zukizwas in Kenya and in South Africa, the Remy in Namibia. People are trying to undo all of these things. Now, I know for some years ago through Ngugi wa Thiong'o, people were saying that, well, you know, what about you stop writing in the colonial language because English is a colonial language, French is a colonial language. Yes, these are important things, but because they have destroyed the landscape of how we gain knowledge so much, we have to use the tools they've created first to beat them at that game and then go back to it. Because if I write a book in Mende, I know how to speak and write Mende. It's my mother tongue. But in Sierra Leone, I can count 5 people on my hands who know how to read it. They can hear it orally. So if I write a book in Mende, who's going to read it? I'm broke as a writer. I have no money because it's me and my grandmother. 2 of us will buy the book. So you also have to think about the world they've set up and how what you're going to do within that, you know, and then translate that. But we have to first undo. And the undoing takes time. And the undoing is not just against them. It's also about the people they've captured. Why doing that? By making them believe that they're more intelligent, that they have the knowledge, that we don't have it, that all of these things, you know?
Yeah.
But you've had people, I'm nowhere special. People have been doing it, the Usman Sembens, everybody has been doing this work for a long time, you know? But we don't get funding from our own governments because they too don't want our people to be smart. They don't want our people to know that they have the knowledge at their hands, because then they will not be able to betray them and rule them and keep them in shackles. So, but the work is going on. And this next generation has access to information in a way that people didn't have before. So they too can check the facts very quickly. Before, it was difficult because if you wanted to find out the truth, you went to your public library, and your public library was run by who? The person who don't want you to know the truth. So they'll have the books that are not going to make you find the truth in that public library, so you're not going to know anything. But now, because of the internet and those things, you can bypass all of those things if you're interested truly and find out what's truly is going on in some places and make your own decision, you know? Oftentimes, still, that mentality is still there. There's still a belittling of what we can bring to the table, you know? As a writer, because I come from Sierra Leone, I'm a Black kid, how many times I have gone to a book reading when somebody will come to me and say, wow, your English is so good. And they say, can you sign my 3 books that I've written? So I always think to myself, well, what should I say to them? Where I even begin that conversation? You know, so sometimes I say, oh, thank you very much, you know. My English is pretty good. I've written 3 books that I'm signing for you now in English. It's not even my language, so, but because the mentality still goes there. Or the next phase is that, oh, do you have a ghostwriter? I've had people ask me if I have a ghostwriter, because it's too much for them to believe that not only a kid like me who comes from that, but also went through that, could actually have any intelligence. And this is how they approach international development as well. They think that people don't have anything to bring to the table. So you're going to bring a kid who's 22 because he graduated from some university. They're going to be in charge of the development of a nation. They have no experience in life, you know? Book smart. Everybody can be intelligent book-wise. I can go and memorize this thing in school and pass. Do you have natural intelligence? Are you able to look at the sun and know that it's going to rain when it reaches there like my grandmother would do? Do you have that knowledge? Do you have instinctual indigenous knowledge? You don't, you know? But how do we make that valuable? It starts with how our own people speak, how our government officials speak, what they do, how they allow themselves to be belittled. When you've seen recently in the conversation where all the African leaders get put in buses and they get taken and all of them have one meeting at the same time to meet somebody, you know, to meet one Western leader. It's that we're allowing these things to happen ourselves because we still are colonized. The mindset still is, the educational system still is, the way of thinking still is. Until we'll undo that, the rest we're just going to be struggling at that. Anyway, this conversation is something we can have for so long.
Absolutely. No,
but it's always good to start somewhere, you know?
A very important first step, obviously, the undoing things. Wow, Ishmael, it has been amazing to hear you speak. You really have a powerful way of communicating and answering all these really wonderful questions today. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for participating in our chat today. Yeah, it has been such a pleasure. We are up on time, I believe. And I don't know if Jackie, would you like to say a few words before we...
Could I say something? I want to say
Absolutely.
thank you to everybody for coming briefly. And also to all the people from on the African continent that are here from the Global South. Thank you for joining as well. And for me, salon people, when I say video online, when I think here, when I'm not tired with you, you know, salon go before one way or the other. Anyway, I was speaking to my Sierra Leoneans. Sorry if anybody felt lost, you know. But I'm always happy to see all of you, and thank you. And thank you to ACIC for hosting this. Jackie, thank you, Kelly, for the wonderful, you're an amazing moderator as well. So thank you for that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just a quick thanks again from us. I know we're going to be connecting a little bit more this week, Ishmael, so we're looking forward to that. And Roshni and I, another ACIC colleague, were messaging back and forth, just saying this was a really warm, wonderful conversation. So thank you both, for sharing. Thanks, Kaylee, for the moderating job and bringing some good reflections. And Ishmael, thank you for some really thought-provoking. Hopefully everyone's going to go home thinking a little bit more about some things this afternoon, which is wonderful and something I think we always strive for. Yeah, some truth thinking, thinking about what we've learned and who has taught us to learn that. So thank you, Ishmael. Yeah. Thanks everyone very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.